Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. Now that the first round was over, a rest period began that would last for 3 incense sticks worth of time. As everyone sat there, the North Bank disciples bristled, glaring angrily at Bai Xiaochun. The contestants were all itching to begin the second round, in which they would do anything possible to take Bai Xiaochun out. By now, none of them cared whether or not the North Bank won in the end, they merely wanted to shed his blood to wash away their humiliation. Bai Xiaochun, in the second round, I'm going to make you pay a horrifying price for humiliating the North Bank. He should be given to an entire pack of beasts to ease our hatred. This second round will be the most painful experience of his life. Take Bai Xiaochun down. Take this shameless bastard down. The North Bank cared about nothing but taking out Bai Xiaochun, and that responsibility was given to the 8 people who had made it through the first round. Although Gongsun simply sat there with his eyes closed, the other 7 glared angrily at Bai Xiaochun with clenched fists. They represented all of the other disciples of the North Bank, and were now analyzing what they had learned about him from his previous performance. All of them were coming up with their own ways of dealing with him. All Bai Xiaochun has are some medicinal pills. As long as he doesn't have a chance to use them, he can be dealt with easily. He only won because of those medicinal pills. Without them, exterminating him will be as easy as turning over your hand. He'll definitely be defeated in the second round. Defeated, and defeated ruthlessly. As far as Bai Xiaochun was concerned, the North Bank disciples were acting like bullies. He'd won, hadn't he? As for the brutality of that victory, he wanted to say something in his defense, but was worried that if he said the wrong thing, it would only make things worse. Much worse. This is ridiculous, he thought. As the North Bank stewed in their anger, the South Bank disciples didn't say much either. They simply sat there bristling until Yang Jia finally spoke. 3 incense sticks have burned. The second round of the chosen battles will now begin, and the top 6 will be selected. Of the 11 of you, 1 will sit out of the fighting and directly enter the top 6. The other 10 will draw lots and fight each other in twos to proceed. Accompanying Yang Jia's words, a beam of light shot out over the arena floor, which transformed into a glowing sphere, roughly 3 meters in diameter. In turn, the pearls in the hands of Bai Xiaochun and the other remaining contestants were tugged toward it. Upon releasing the pearls, they flew directly toward the glowing sphere. Once inside, new numbers appeared on their surfaces, from 1 to 10, with one of the pearls being blank. The 11 pearls began to rotate inside the sphere, moving faster and faster until they were nothing more than a blur. A secret magic is at work here to ensure complete and utter fairness, explained Yang Jia. Not even I can interfere with the pearls. Rest at ease as you take the marbles back to decide the order of fighting. Shu Song glared at Bai Xiaochun and then chuckled coldly. Bai Xiaochun, you'd better pray that you don't fight me. I'll crush you like a twig. With that, he waved his hand, causing a pearl to fly out into his hand. One of the other North Bank chosen gritted his teeth and coldly said, it doesn't matter who you face, you're definitely going to lose painfully in the second round. With that, he and everyone else, Bai Xiaochun included, made grasping motions to secure their pearls. Instantly, 10 pearls flew out toward the group of contestants. I have number 3. I'm number 7. I got number 1. When the North Bank disciples got their pearls, they announced the numbers. Soon, the order of fighting was becoming clear. After they announced their numbers, they looked ferociously toward Bai Xiaochun. Eventually, Gongsun got his pearl and coolly said, number 9. The North Bank disciples soon found that not a single one of their number had acquired the blank pearl. As of this moment, the only pearls left were numbers 4 and 10, as well as the blank pearl. The North Bank disciples began to look nervously over at the South Bank. I'm number 4, Shangguan Tianyu announced coolly. Number 10, Zhou Xinqi said, her face somewhat unsightly. As soon as the words left her mouth, she looked over at Gongsun. By now, everyone's fighting spot had been determined, with the exception of Bai Xiaochun. Strange expressions appeared on the faces of the South Bank audience, especially the fragrant Cloud Peak disciples, who had been there to watch Bai Xiaochun fight in the smaller competition. Their eyes went as wide as saucers. No way, they thought incredulously. Even more incredulous than them were the North Bank disciples, who so badly wanted to teach him a lesson. Fists clenched, the entire group stared blankly at Bai Xiaochun. Bai Xiaochun couldn't keep from looking a bit proud. The pearl in his hand had no number on it whatsoever. At first, he'd thought that he might have seen incorrectly. However, after closer examination, he confirmed that it was indeed blank. Then he looked around and realized that everyone was staring at him, and suddenly, he realized how lonely life could be sometimes. Flicking his sleeve, he assumed the manner of a lonely hero, staring up into the clouds. Voice cool, he said, "My apologies. I'll be sitting this round out. If you want to fight me, you'll have to work hard to get to the next round." His words were met with a moment of silence. A few breaths worth of time passed, and then the North Bank audience erupted into enraged shouting. "Impossible. Damn it, he's sitting the round out. Why did it have to be him, the shameless Bai Xiaochun? Why? How could he be so lucky? Out of 11 people, I can't believe that he gets to sit the round out. How could someone like him have luck like this? It's preposterous. I can't take this. What an absolute show-off. I have to take him down." The North Bank disciples had intended to wash their humiliation clean with violence, but now that Bai Xiaochun was sitting the round out, they very nearly coughed up mouthfuls of blood. It was almost like they had just tried to punch Bai Xiaochun in the face, but ended up striking nothing but air. Frustration fermenting inside of them, Shu Song and the others stared at Bai Xiaochun as if they wished they could rip him to pieces right then and there. Even the South Bank disciples looked on with odd expressions, unsure of what to say. It was already obvious that the North Bank disciples wanted to fight Bai Xiaochun more than anything else, so it wasn't even necessary to ponder how they felt regarding this sudden development. "That's nothing," blurted out a random fragrant Cloud Peak disciple. Back in the minor competition, Sect Uncle Bai sat out for 2 rounds in a row. When the people sitting around him heard that, their eyes went wide with disbelief. This happened to him before? Sect Uncle Bai's luck is unbelievable. Bai Xiaochun cleared his throat, and yet again assumed the posture of a lonely hero. Looking over at the North Bank side, he slowly shook his head. That, of course, made the North Bank even angrier. However, getting angrier didn't change the situation at all. They had no option but to stifle their feelings as the second round of the chosen battles began. Unfortunately, without Bai Xiaochun fighting, the entire affair was a lot less interesting. Furthermore, the South Bank only had 2 disciples in the mix, which meant that 3 of the battles would involve disciples from the North Bank fighting each other. The first battle was just such a situation. Gongsun Waner fought one of the other North Bank disciples and defeated him effortlessly. The defeated disciple trudged off of the arena floor, looking over his shoulder at the South Bank side, mixed emotions playing across his face. The second battle saw Shangguan Tianyu take the field. Luckily for him, he didn't face one of the top chosen, but another random disciple, whom he defeated as easily as blowing some dust off of his shoulder. The South Bank audience breathed sighs of relief. At least, they had secured victory in one fight. Next, the North Bank again fought itself in the third and fourth battles. Although the fighting was intense, the fact that the South Bank wasn't involved at all ensured that the disciples that were from there simply looked on silently. In the final battle, Zhou Xinqi walked out with a serious expression on her face. Although the South Bank disciples cheered, they weren't too optimistic about the outcome of the battle. After all, Zhou Xinqi's opponent was the terrifying Ghost Fang, who had almost killed Lu Tinlei with the single wave of a finger. After stepping out onto the arena floor, Ghost Fang curiously asked, "Between you and that lightning guy, who's stronger?" Sensing that his intention was not to humiliate her, Zhou Xinqi answered honestly, "Elder brother Lu is a bit stronger." "How about this?" Ghost replied quietly, "I used 70% power last time. This time, I'll only use 40%. You probably won't get killed by that." Those who could hear him looked on with bitter smiles, convinced that Ghost Fang was being honest. Zhou Xinqi took a deep breath and then performed a double-handed incantation gesture. Instantly, countless blue sparks appeared around her, forming numerous blue flying silks. The flying silks then merged together into something that resembled a huge flower that pulsed with a powerful gravitational force. Plant transformation incantation. When the crowd from the South Bank saw the plant transformation incantation being used, their eyes glittered. Although it wasn't quite on the same level as Ghosts Haunt the Night or the Water Swamp Kingdom, it was one of the 10 secret magics of the sect. It was a unique magic that used plants against the enemy, with numerous variations that made it enigmatic and unpredictable. When Li Qinghao used it, he could create a world of plants and vegetation 50 kilometers wide. The final upgraded version of the secret magic had another name: Magic Plant Arsenal. Using the magic was such a drain on Zhou Xingqi's energy that her face went pale. She knew that she wasn't a match for this opponent, but in her world, it wasn't an option to just concede without trying. The wave of her hand caused the blue flower to tremble, and then grow larger at a rapid rate, simultaneously shooting toward Ghostfang. It almost looked like the flower was opening wide to consume him. It was a spectacular sight that instantly attracted the attention of Bai Xiaochun, who found the magical technique particularly interesting. However, it was at this point that Ghostfang looked up calmly and then waved his finger. This time, he didn't wave his finger at the sky, but at Zhou Xingqi. The air next to him began to vibrate, and a huge black-clawed ghost hand appeared, which quickly clenched into a fist. The huge fist filled half of the arena floor, and was so big people couldn't see anything else. It smashed into the blue flower, which trembled and then collapsed into ashes. The clawed ghost hand, however, didn't stop. It continued on as if nothing had happened, smashing directly into Zhou Xingqi. A massive boom echoed out, and blood sprayed out of Zhou Xingqi's mouth as she tumbled backward. She was knocked out of the arena floor, and when she finally ground to a halt, she coughed up 8 mouthfuls of blood. Face pale, she looked up with a stubborn gleam in her eyes to see Ghostfang turning and walking away. Everything was silent except for the gasps that echoed out. After a protracted moment of silence, both the South and North Bank audiences broke out into hushed discussions. So strong. Ghostfang could probably crush inner sect disciples with ease. He must be the strongest disciple under Foundation establishment. That's the ultimate battle prowess of the Qi condensation stage. He's definitely reached the realm of will. Only by possessing a mysterious and unfathomable will can someone produce such terrifying power. It was almost as if no one dared to speak in a loud voice. The North Bank chosen looked on with mixed emotions. After all, no one would be happy to have someone so powerful appear among their generation. On the South Bank side, Shangguan Tianyu stood there silently, his heart anything but calm. Watching Ghostfang defeat the other chosen was just like watching a chosen defeat ordinary disciples. It was more than clear that Ghostfang existed on a totally different plane than even the other chosen. Bai Xiaochun was left trembling. He had only seen Ghostfang make 2 attacks, and yet each one had been completely astonishing. By this point, the top 6 had been selected. The North Bank had 4, and the South Bank had 2. They were Shangguan Tianyu, Bai Xiaochun, Ghostfang, the Gongsun siblings, and Shusong. Those disciples who were familiar with the chosen battles knew that the next round, round 3, would be the final round. The matches to follow, and the resulting victories and defeats, would determine the final ranking of the top 6 disciples. Anyone who could secure 5 victories would naturally take first place. During the past 1,000 years, the North Bank had always swept the South Bank and taken the top spots. Furthermore, the South Bank disciples all knew that Ghostfang was exactly the type of person who could defeat everyone else. He was simply too powerful. The South Bank audience sat there quietly. If Ghostfang weren't in the picture, they might hold hope that Shangguan Tianyu could take first place. Second place isn't bad though. That was what many of the South Bank disciples were thinking as they sat there sighing. Some of them looked over at Bai Xiaochun. Many had a hard time determining exactly what they thought of him, but regardless of the specifics, he hadn't given any of them the impression that he was a fighter. In fact, he hadn't fought anyone since joining the sect. The only thing they did know for certain was that he had come back alive after the Luokan clan tried to chase him down and kill him. Many of the South Bank disciples had already resigned themselves to the fact that the South Bank had lost, both in terms of the number of disciples who made it into the top 10, and also the first place spot. In contrast, the North Bank disciples were getting excited. Their eyes shone with anticipation and ferocity as they glared at Bai Xiaochun. The rules for the top 6 probably haven't changed. This time, Bai Xiaochun is definitely going to be hurting. That's right. According to the rules, everyone will fight once with all the other disciples. That means that 4 blazing suns from the North Bank will all have a chance to pummel him. Finally, the humiliation our North Bank has endured will be avenged. It wasn't just the ordinary North Bank disciples who were musing in such a way. Shusong and the Gongsun siblings were all chuckling coldly as they stared at Bai Xiaochun, determined to come out victorious. Bai Xiaochun shrunk back a bit. Looking over at the furious North Bank disciples, he shook his head a bit helplessly. Immortal cultivation is supposed to be about living forever. What's the point of all the fighting and killing? It was at this point that Yang Jia's voice finally rang out. The third round of the chosen battles will follow the same rules as before. Victory will be given to whoever takes the most wins. The first set of matches will be Shangguan Tianyu vs Xu Song, Ghost Fong vs Gongsun Yun, and Bai Xiaochun vs Gongsun Waner. These fights will be carried out simultaneously. With that, a beam of light descended from the balcony onto the arena floor, dividing it into 3 areas. Ceiling barriers immediately sprang up to separate them. Shangguan Tianyu's eyes flickered brightly as he dashed out into the first battle zone. At the same time, Xu Song also flew out. The two of them locked eyes, both of their expressions grave. They wasted no time on words. Xu Song waved his hand, and 3 fierce beasts materialized around him. Each one was unique, but they were all incredibly ferocious in appearance. Even as they began to charge Shangguan Tianyu, a huge crocodilian mouth appeared above him, which closed in to consume him. In addition to all that, the ground beneath his feet cracked as numerous tentacles burst out. Meanwhile, Ghost Fong strode forward into the second battle zone. Off to the side, Gongsun Yun stood there quietly. Although the bugs which writhed in his eyes were powerful, he knew that he was no match for Ghost Fong. Despite that, he wasn't willing to simply concede. Even if you were more powerful than you already are, I'd still want to fight you. Taking a deep breath, he joined Ghost Fong in the second battle zone. Gongsun Waner snorted coldly as she stepped forward, glaring at Bai Xiaochun. Of all the disciples present, Bai Xiaochun feared her the least, so he tromped forward to the third battle zone, meeting her gaze with his own glare. As Bai Xiaochun walked out, the North Bank disciples heckled him furiously. Completely ignoring the other 2 battle zones, their attention and fury was directed solely upon Bai Xiaochun. Elder sister Gongsun, eradicate that damned Bai Xiaochun. Kill him. Gongsun Waner's eyes flickered with cold light. Instead of summoning her 7-colored phoenix, she performed an incantation gesture and then tapped down on her forehead. 7-colored light immediately sprang out from within her, accompanied by a frigid blast of cold air which covered the ground in frost. Why don't you concede? Bai Xiaochun said, blinking. When I attack, I frighten even myself. Almost immediately, an image popped up in Gongsun Waner's mind of Beihan Lai's tragic fate, and her face flushed. At the same time, a murderous aura rose up within her. Shut up, you perv. I'm gonna make you pay a heavy price for what you've done. With the wave of a hand, she summoned an ice blade which then shot toward Bai Xiaochun. Bai Xiaochun shrugged helplessly. He had merely been telling the truth, and wasn't sure why he'd been called a perv. Sighing, he slapped his bag of holding, causing countless talismans to appear, which he began to slap down all over his body. Rumbling sounds could then be heard as numerous shields sprang up. Soon, they were nearly 3 meters thick, glittering with multicolored light. It was a shocking sight, and yet, Bai Xiaochun wasn't finished yet. Next, he produced the divine crane shield, which glittered brightly as it produced yet another shield layer. Then there was the bracelet Li Qinghao had given him. As soon as he activated it, it spread out to cover his entire body, turning him pitch black. Considering he was also wearing a big black walk on his back, Bai Xiaochun looked completely eye-catching. Furthermore, the speed and ease with which he activated all of his defenses made it obvious that he was very familiar with doing so. The North Bank disciples' eyes widened, and they watched blankly as the ice blades slammed into Bai Xiaochun's shields, breaking some of them, but eventually shattering. Bai Xiaochun remained inside, completely unharmed. If that were all there were to it, it might not be a big deal, but what was most infuriating was that Bai Xiaochun merely stood there, hands clasped behind his back, chin sticking out, looking up at the clouds like a hero. Too weak, he said, flicking his sleeve and then placing his hands behind his back again. But then again, I've never met anyone who could break through all of my shields. Gongsun Waner's eyes seemed to be on the verge of popping out of her skull. She had fought many people in her life, but had never met anyone so adept in using defensive shields. Bai Xiaochun was the first. She could see that he had dozens of ordinary shields protecting him, plus the divine crane shield, the black substance covering his skin, the huge walk on his back, and numerous leather jackets. She was left feeling annoyed, uneasy, and even a bit taken aback. The North Bank audience wasn't happy either. Completely shameless. I can't believe he has so many defensive talismans and magical items. Damn it, these are the chosen battles, not the resource battles. Elder sister Gongsun has to wipe him out. I'm about to explode. Just looking at him makes me want to walk over and beat the crap out of him. The North Bank audience was incensed, and the South Bank audience simply looked on in a daze. Of course, there were some disciples from Fragrant Cloud Peak who sighed inwardly. That was especially true of one burly man. When he saw what was happening, tears welled up in his eyes. He knew exactly how the North Bank disciples felt. Back in the minor competition years before, Bai Xiaochun had tormented him in exactly this same way. Up on the balcony, the sect leader and the others almost couldn't believe their eyes, and quickly began to exchange wry grins. Gongsun Waner gritted her teeth and performed a double-handed incantation gesture. Immediately, a vast quantity of ice blades appeared, transforming into a vortex that shot toward Bai Xiaochun. Booms echoed out over and over again as the razor-sharp blades sliced into Bai Xiaochun's shields. Although many of the shields were destroyed, the flickering divine crane shield eventually made short work of the ice blades. Still too weak, Bai Xiaochun said loftily. Inwardly, happiness blossomed in his heart like a flower as he realized what it felt like to be a powerful expert. The North Bank disciples were in a frenzy. If it weren't for the fact that they didn't dare to break sect rules, they would surely have charged over en masse to slaughter Bai Xiaochun. Gongsun Waner's eyes were bloodshot. Gritting her teeth, she continued to unleash attacks, using even more ice blades than before. The sheer number involved was shocking, to the point where even Bai Xiaochun's heart began to tremble in fear. After some time passed, his shields finally gave out completely, whereupon he drew upon the full power of the divine crane shield. In the blink of an eye, his defenses were shored up, and he breathed a sigh of relief. He stuck his chin up, and just when he was about to say something, the bedraggled Gongsun Waner let out a piercing scream. Rumbling sounds echoed out, and blood oozed out of the corners of her mouth. Astonishingly, a blood-colored ice flower appeared on her forehead, which caused the energy of heaven and earth to flow toward her in shocking fashion. As this happened, the North Bank disciples began to cheer at the top of their lungs. It's elder sister Gongsun's Bloodfrost Orchid. The Bloodfrost Orchid is elder sister Gongsun's trump card. Not even someone in the 9th level of Qi condensation could block it. Bai Xiaochun's defenses are definitely going to be broken through this time. As the freezing flower flew out, radiating a terrifying aura, it caused the surrounding temperature to drop rapidly. It shot toward Bai Xiaochun at top speed, cutting through his defenses like a hot knife through butter. His shields shattered, and just when he was about to use the divine crane shield, the Bloodfrost Orchid split into two parts. One part was successfully blocked, but the other twisted past to slam violently into Bai Xiaochun's chest. A banging sound could be heard, and Bai Xiaochun looked down in surprise. To him, it felt like getting hit with a fluffy snowball. Shivering slightly, he looked up at Gongsun Waner, whose hair was by now completely disheveled. Take your time, he said. I'm going to watch some of the other matches. With that, he turned in the direction of the first and second battle zones, which he began to casually watch, even occasionally cheering for one side or the other. No matter your perspective, he looked like he was asking for a beating. In the second battle zone, Ghost Fong was just on the verge of waving his finger through the air a second time. He could defeat most people with the single wave of a finger, but not Gongsun Yun. As for Gongsun Yun, he dashed backward at top speed and barked that he conceded. He had been able to stand up to one of Ghost Fang's finger attacks, but any more, and he would suffer serious injuries. Knowing that he had no chance of taking first place, he decided that contending for second place would be the best thing to do. Clasping his hands to Ghost Fong, he left the arena floor. As he did, he glanced over in the direction of Gongsun Waner and frowned. Ghost Fang's expression was placid as he left the arena floor and returned to where he had been standing all along. When he looked over at Bai Xiaochun and all of his defenses, a strange gleam appeared in his eyes. The audience members from the South Bank were all looking down, averting their gazes from the scene playing out on the arena floor. Embarrassed, they actually felt sorry for the North Bank. The North Bank disciples were going crazy. Gongsun Waner was frantic, screaming as she launched one attack after another at Bai Xiaochun, using every technique she could think of. She unleashed countless divine abilities and magical techniques, and yet, nothing could break Bai Xiaochun's defenses. After all, his final line of defense was the black bracelet, a life-saving magic that could protect him from a blow by a Foundation establishment cultivator. After the time it takes an incense stick to burn, Gongsun Waner coughed up a mouthful of blood and collapsed onto the ground, staring at Bai Xiaochun with listless despair. She was about to summon her phoenix when Bai Xiaochun looked over at her and suddenly produced a medicinal pill, which he began to toss up and down in his palm. Furious, Gongsun Waner clenched her hands into fists. "I concede," she said begrudgingly, eyes flickering with defiance. Clasping hands and looking as superior as possible, he said, "You let me win. It seems you know what's best, and didn't force me to attack." In response to his words, tears leaked out of the eyes of the South Bank disciples. Gongsun Waner was so mad she was shaking. Gritting her teeth, she stalked off of the arena floor. It was at this point that the battle between Shangguan Tianyu and Xu Song reached its conclusion. Shangguan Tianyu's sword descended, and intense light shone out in all directions. Xu Song's 5 beasts were all in bad shape, and he himself staggered backward several paces, looking at Shangguan Tianyu in admiration. "It turns out sword spirit bodies really are pretty incredible," he said, blood oozing out of his mouth. Finally, he turned and walked off of the arena floor. Shangguan Tianyu didn't respond. Instead, he looked over at Ghost Fong, his eyes glittering, completely convinced of who his only true opponent was. "Presumably, he feels the same way I do," he thought, "that fighting against these other people is simply boring." Shangguan Tianyu retrieved his flying sword and looked over at Bai Xiaochun. When he saw all of his defenses, a gleam of scorn appeared in his eyes. Finally, he walked off of the arena floor, accompanied by the cheers of the South Bank disciples. At the same time, Bai Xiaochun walked proudly back to his spot. The first set of matches of the third round was over. The victors were Ghost Fong, Shangguan Tianyu, and Bai Xiaochun, with the losers being Xu Song and the Gongsun siblings. Of course, not many people had paid much attention to the victories won by Shangguan Tianyu and Ghost Fong. Most people had been focused on Bai Xiaochun's repeated shamelessness. Bai Xiaochun had succeeded in completely altering the atmosphere of the competition. In fact, it was hard to say exactly how much he had influenced the sect as a whole. The North Bank disciples' eyes were bright red, their hands clenched into fists as they glared at Bai Xiaochun. As tens of thousands of eyes stared at him, he scratched his nose, pretending not to notice. Gongsun Waner was so angry she was shaking. Her brother, Gongsun Yun, murmured something to her, after which she clenched her teeth and sat down cross-legged to restore her energy. Everyone else soon followed suit. The rest period lasted for the time it takes 3 incense sticks to burn. After that, the second match of the third round formally began. In the first battle region, Ghost Fong was up against Gongsun Waner. As soon as she stepped into the battle region and faced the expressionless Ghost Fong, she conceded. She couldn't afford to be injured, lest it affect her subsequent matches. With Gongsun Waner having conceded, Ghost Fong took another victory. Meanwhile, in the second battle region, booms echoed out as Shangguan Tianyu fought Gongsun Yun, who had managed to stand up to Ghost Fong for one finger attack. Bugs poured out of Gongsun Yun's sleeves, blotting out the sky as they rushed toward Shangguan Tianyu. Shangguan Tianyu's expression turned slightly more somber as he waved his right hand, sending a flying sword buzzing out, bursting with sword chi. It should have been a battle that everyone watched closely. However, audiences from both the South Bank and the North Bank were all staring at the third battle zone. That was where Bai Xiaochun had loftily taken the stage to fight against Xu Song. Xu Song looked over at him with a cold smile. "You might be good with medicinal pills and defenses. But now that you've met me, you're doomed to meet a painful end." With that, Xu Song waved his hand violently through the air, causing cracking sounds to ring out as 3 beasts appeared out of thin air. One of them was a 3-meter-tall gorilla, another was a huge tiger, and the last was a gigantic bat. As soon as they appeared, they radiated powerful energy that would crush even someone in the 9th level of chi condensation. "All right, Bai Xiaochun, let's see if your defenses can stand up to a sustained volley by my 3 battle beasts." Smiling viciously, he prepared to attack. "Why don't you concede?" Bai Xiaochun said. Sighing, he produced an aphrodisiac pill and looked sympathetically over at Xu Song. The North Bank disciples were thrown into fits of rage. He said it again. "Eradicate Bai Xiaochun." When Xu Song saw the medicinal pill, he threw his head back and laughed uproariously. Face filled with derision and even complacency, he said, "I knew all along that you would try to use that shameless medicinal pill. Did you really think I would come unprepared? I set these 3 battle beasts aside just for you. They're all female. It was because of this that Shu Song was so confident, convinced that he would be able to give the North Bank a chance to get revenge. When the North Bank disciples heard his words, they instantly got excited, and began to cheer for Shu Song. Bai Xiaochun's heart thumped, and his eyes turned up in thought. After a moment, he looked back at Shu Song, eyes filled with sympathy as he said, "This medicinal pill is effective on humans too, not just animals." With that, he looked meaningfully at Shu Song's 3 female battle beasts. His words sent the North Bank disciples into complete silence. They stared in shock, subconsciously visualizing certain scenes in their mind, cruel scenes that caused them to gasp. Shu Song's eyes went wide, and his mind filled with thunderous rumbling. His face drained of blood as he contemplated how both Beihan Lai and Gongsun Waner had both lost. He suddenly realized that if what Bai Xiaochun said was true, and the medicinal pill's aphrodisiac effects worked on people, he swallowed nervously. Without even thinking about it, he edged away from his 3 battle beasts, trembling. In turn, the 3 battle beasts, intelligent as they were, looked over at Shu Song and also began to tremble. Without the slightest hesitation, Shu Song quickly put them away, not daring to bet that Bai Xiaochun was bluffing. Even though he had the feeling that Bai Xiaochun was most likely lying, he didn't want to risk it. Even as the trembling Shu Song put away his battle beasts, Bai Xiaochun strode forward. Light flickered as his defenses went up, and as he closed in on Shu Song, he reached his right hand back and then waved it out in front of him. A blast of power surged out. Shu Song's strength lay in his control of beasts, and at the moment, he didn't dare to use even a single one. That cut his effective power in half, and made it impossible for him to stand up to Bai Xiaochun. He was instantly sent flying, blood spraying out of his mouth. When he staggered to a stop, rage and humiliation filled his eyes as he shrieked that he conceded. Bai Xiaochun blinked and then cleared his throat. Clasping hands and bowing, he strutted off the arena floor amidst the countless enraged curses from the North Bank disciples. Bai Xiaochun, why you? That damned medicinal pill ought to be destroyed. Heavens, I'll pay 10 spirit stones to anyone who can take down Bai Xiaochun. I'll put in 50 spirit stones. Take him out. The North Bank was going crazy, and countless people began to shout out that they would add spirit stones as well. Soon the total was over 10,000. The shocked South Bank disciples looked at Bai Xiaochun, their admiration for him growing by leaps and bounds. The huge bounty caused Bai Xiaochun's face to flicker, and he hurried to escape the arena floor. It felt like a cold wind was blowing up his back, especially when the total bounty passed 20,000 spirit stones. His heart began to thump. "You people are so unreasonable," he said loudly, hoping to explain. "Every single time I go out there, I always give them a chance to concede." His explanation only further enraged the North Bank disciples, and soon the spirit stone bounty reached 30,000. Up overhead, the phoenix reveled in Bai Xiaochun's misfortune, and let out continuous piercing cries. The elders on the balcony were getting more and more amused. "I'm a prestige disciple," Bai Xiaochun cried threateningly. "I'm the junior brother of the sect leader. If anybody tries to put a bounty on me, I'll have my master kick them out of the sect." Then, the North Bank disciples went even crazier. It was hard to say who lost control first, but a flying sword appeared and shot toward the arena floor. Countless North Bank disciples all produced various magical items, and their battle beasts roared as if they were preparing to fight a bloody war. Bai Xiaochun fled in terror. Thankfully, the sect elders on the balcony couldn't let matters go any further. With a single glance, they held back the North Bank disciples. It was around this time that the battle between Shangguan Tianyu and Gongsun Yun ended. Shangguan Tianyu had used 3 flying swords, and Gongsun Yun had gone all out with everything he possessed. In the end, Gongsun Yun conceded, ending the fight. Shangguan Tianyu was slightly out of breath. Gongsun Yun had been strong enough that he had been forced to really start fighting hard. When he left the arena floor and noticed how enraged the North Bank disciples were, he frowned and looked over at Bai Xiaochun. Although his eyes flickered with contempt, his heart twinged with jealousy. "Relying only on medicinal pills and defenses? I can't believe we've reached the same stage. HMPH. With that, Shangguan Tianyu sat down cross-legged and closed his eyes to do breathing exercises. The chosen battles this time around. Up on the balcony, sect leader Zheng Yuandong shook his head helplessly. The peak lords sitting around him smiled wryly. The chosen battles were supposed to be a solemn occasion, but not this time around, and everyone knew it. Things had begun normally, but the simple addition of Bai Xiaochun into the mix turned everything sour. Bai Xiaochun. His name sounds good, but he isn't the least bit pure in any sense of the word. Elder Zhou chuckled wryly, looking down at Bai Xiaochun hiding in the crowd, and then over at the countless enraged North Bank disciples. It was at this point that the Peak Lord from Irispetal Peak, the old woman, smiled darkly and said, "It's fine. Bai Xiaochun might be naughty and mischievous, but he's made himself the archenemy of the entire North Bank. We just need to find an opportunity to transfer him to the North Bank. That would calm him down quite a bit." The eyes of the others present flickered thoughtfully. The only one who reacted differently was Li Qinghao, who looked over at the old woman sympathetically. Based on how well he knew Bai Xiaochun, he was fairly certain that if Bai Xiaochun was transferred to the North Bank, the unlucky party wouldn't be him. As the group continued to ponder the situation, the third match began. Ghostfang fought Shusong, and Shangguan Tianyu took on Gongsun Waner, but neither battle was even worth watching. Both Ghostfang and Shangguan Tianyu were so strong that they won easily. The disciples of both banks, as well as the sect leader and the others, were all watching the third battle zone. Gongsun Yun was the first to enter the area, pulsing with energy and icy coldness. Moments later, Bai Xiaochun strolled up, looking like a powerful hero. Instead of yelling in rage, the North Bank disciples glared murderously. To have so many eyes glaring at him like that left Bai Xiaochun more than a little jumpy. Taking a deep breath, he looked over at Gongsun Yun. Aphrodisiac pill in hand, he said, "Why don't you concede?" Gongsun Yun looked coldly back at him, eyes shining with hatred. Waving his sleeve, he sent countless black beetles flying out from within his clothes. There were also red centipedes that scurried across the ground at top speed. The sight of so many bugs was completely shocking. Voice cool, Gongsun Yun gave Bai Xiaochun no chance to say anything further. "My bugs might be classified as male and female, but they're not beasts. Your medicinal pill won't work on them." The bugs caused an ear-splitting droning sound to fill the air. They were like a sea, surging directly toward Bai Xiaochun. Every bug that made up the sea possessed a certain level of attack power. Although defensive shields could resist them, when their power was combined, they would be quite formidable. Bai Xiaochun was even fairly certain that in this situation, Gongsun Yun actually had a bit of an advantage. "Don't force my hand, Gongsun Yun," Bai Xiaochun shouted, backing up at top speed, his face paling. "Concede immediately. I really don't want to attack, you know. Once I do, you're done for." Gongsun Yun chuckled coldly. "Let's see which happens first, your flesh getting eaten off your bones, or me being done for." Looking even more scornful than before, he waved his hand, sending even more bugs surging forth. The crowd from the South Bank looked on in fear and astonishment. Everyone watching had already been convinced of how powerful Gongsun Yun was. Not only was he adept at using bugs, he also had powerful magical techniques. He was able to defend against one of Ghostfang's finger attacks, and even forced Shangguan Tianyu to attack 3 times with his sword, tiring him out significantly. The North Bank audience looked on, their excitement building. "Nice job, elder brother Gongsun. Take Bai Xiaochun down. Ha ha ha, let's see how you fight back this time, Bai Xiaochun. You just wait, those bugs are going to burrow into your flesh and eat you alive. Your comeuppance is at hand, Bai Xiaochun." The countless North Bank disciples were extremely excited. Furthermore, their battle beasts could sense their master's excitement, and began to howl in response. In the blink of an eye, the black beetles were right in front of Bai Xiaochun, slamming into his defensive shields, ripping and tearing at them with their mandibles. The shields quickly began to fade and grow dim. Then the red centipedes arrived, causing his defenses to weaken even more quickly. Some of them even managed to gnaw their way past the shields. Bai Xiaochun's scalp tingled with fright, and his eyes went bloodshot. "Gongsun Yun, you're forcing my hand." Bai Xiaochun was reaching the point of having no choice but to use his trump card, something he'd hoped to avoid. Taking a deep breath, heart pounding, he sent a surge of energy into the shields, blasting away a significant portion of the bugs. Even as they turned to charge back toward him, an aphrodisiac pill appeared in his hand, which he threw in the direction of the North Bank audience. The pill shot through the air with a whooshing sound, and before anyone could react, was in the air above the stands on the north side of the arena. The disciples gaped in shock, and at the same time, Bai Xiaochun shouted, "Detonate." A boom rang out as the aphrodisiac pill exploded, transforming into ash which drifted down in all directions, covering nearly half of the North Bank disciples. Gongsun Yun's eyes went wide with shock. Bai Xiaochun actually wasn't sure whether or not the pill would have an effect on humans. He had never dared to personally test out any of the mystery pills he'd concocted. However, he was certain that the pill was effective on animals, and would stimulate them to a shocking degree. In the blink of an eye, the ash that was the remains of the aphrodisiac pill had fallen down onto the battle beasts below, which began to throw their heads back and howl. Their bodies grew larger, their eyes turned red, and they began to pant heavily. In turn, their masters cried out in alarm and began to back up. It took only a moment for the North Bank disciples to devolve into a stampede, quickly clearing the entire area of people. The only thing that remained were the howling beasts, sitting there looking around for a target. The North Bank disciples all began to shriek at the tops of their lungs. Bai Xiaochun. At the same time, beads of sweat popped out on Gongsun Yun's forehead, which was shocking considering that after beginning to cultivate the Tao of bugs, he had never sweat. Now, though, he was panting heavily as Bai Xiaochun slowly pulled out another medicinal pill. As soon as he did, the stimulated battle beasts began to tremble in excitement. Gongsun Yun couldn't help but think about what had occurred when a pill just like that had been shattered and then spread onto Beihan Lai. An intense feeling of foreboding rose up in his heart, and he began to tremble. Images flashed through his mind, and he began to back up. Even his legs were shaking. He could well imagine what would happen if Bai Xiaochun crushed that pill on him, and then the battle beasts pounced. "You forced my hand," Bai Xiaochun said with a despairing scowl. "I didn't want to do this." With that, he pulled his hand back in preparation to throw the pill. "I concede," shrieked Gongsun Yun in the most high-pitched voice that had left his mouth in his entire life. His face was ashen as he raced off of the arena floor. Only when he was safe amongst the crowd did he look back in fright at Bai Xiaochun. Bai Xiaochun's jaw dropped at the sight of the terrified Gongsun Yun hiding in the crowd. Then he looked at the trembling battle beasts, and suddenly had a very bad feeling. Many of them were howling at the tops of their lungs, eyes fixed directly on the medicinal pill he held in his hand. They were already started to edge toward him. Drops of sweat broke out on his forehead, and he suddenly turned to look at the crowd of North Bank disciples. That simple turn of his head caused the North Bank disciples' hearts to seize with fear. Bai Xiaochun turned to look in another direction, but quickly found that any place he looked at would quickly become devoid of people. Everyone would scramble away at top speed, screaming in desperation. Finally, his gaze came to rest on the South Bank disciples. Instantly, their scalps went numb, and they began to back up. In the blink of an eye, everyone had retreated by 30 meters. "We're on the same side, Sect Uncle Bai," people began to cry out. The same side. Even Ghost Fong and Shangguan Tianyu were backing up, their faces flickering with shock. Roar. More of the stimulated battle beasts began to walk forward, their eyes crimson, salivating as they eyed Bai Xiaochun. "What do I do?" he thought. "What do I do? Didn't I warn you people to concede? Didn't I say that I fear my own attacks?" Feeling that he was completely innocent in the matter, he gritted his teeth and looked over at the North Bank audience. "Didn't you people just say something about putting a bounty on my head?" None of the trembling North Bank disciples dared to even look Bai Xiaochun in the eye. Bai Xiaochun's heart was also trembling. In his heart, he believed himself to be a good person, and wasn't willing to simply throw the pill out in a random direction. Anxiety building up within him, he looked at the increasingly stimulated battle beasts, and then finally happened to glance up into the sky above him and notice the proud, arrogant phoenix of Elder Zhou's. Eyes shining, and having no time to consider the matter, he launched the medicinal pill at top speed toward the phoenix. It transformed into a beam of light shooting through the air. The phoenix was in the middle of gloating over Bai Xiaochun's misfortune, and didn't even notice the pill flying toward him at first. When he did, his feathers all stood on end, and he let out a miserable shriek. Just when he was about to dodge, the pill exploded, covering him with a fine powder. The phoenix stared in shock as the battle beasts below began to howl. Eyes burning as if with fire, they began to leap up into the air as if to chase down the phoenix. The sect leader and the others gasped, crowding around the edge of the balcony to look down at what was happening. At one point, one of the random elders asked, "Is attacking the audience against the rules?" However, nobody seemed to care about that at the moment. All of them were staring down into the north stands, at the area devoid of people but filled with battle beasts. The remaining 3 peak lords from the north bank all had strange looks in their eyes as they stared at one particular beast among the crowd. It looked like a deer, and was currently howling up into the air under the effects of the aphrodisiac pill. Before, I assumed that pill's effectiveness was limited to beasts with third-order bloodlines. I never imagined that it would also be effective on second-order bloodlines. That pill would be incredibly useful to us on the north bank. The 3 peak lords from the north bank were trembling in excitement. The old woman among their number then waved her right finger through the air toward the phoenix. Instantly, the phoenix trembled as a powerful force wrapped around it and dragged it down toward the balcony. At the same time, the battle beasts roared and flew in the same direction. The old woman snorted coldly and looked down at the beasts, which then began to howl mournfully. Another powerful force swept them up, sending them spinning toward her. As they approached, they shrank down and disappeared into her sleeve. The old woman looked over at the miserable, shrieking phoenix, eyes shining as she turned to confer with the other peak lords. Off to the side, Elder Zhou's face had turned green. Bai Xiaochun seemed no worse for the wear. Heaving a sigh of relief, he was just about to walk off the arena floor when the North Bank's disciples recovered from the fear of the threat which had been levied against them, and began to roar in anger. "I'm gonna kill you, Bai Xiaochun. Bai Xiaochun, the North Bank will never rest until you're dead. Exterminate Bai Xiaochun." The North Bank disciples had veins bulging out on their necks and faces as they howled in fury. In response, Bai Xiaochun turned back to look at them, and raised an ordinary medicinal pill up into the air as he stuck his jaw out. Instantly, the entire crowd trembled and went completely silent. Bai Xiaochun waved his sleeve and chuckled darkly. Popping the medicinal pill into his mouth, he left the arena floor. Behind him, the North Bank disciples erupted in rage yet again. The disciples of the South Bank looked at Bai Xiaochun in admiration, and even began to give voice to their feelings. Sect Uncle Bai is a god. Sect Uncle Bai has become the archenemy of the North Bank, a path that cannot be returned from. But how far will he go? Many of them were even rejoicing at the fact that Bai Xiaochun wasn't from the North Bank. If he were, it was impossible to imagine how much the South Bank would have suffered. Sect Uncle Bai is enough for our South Bank. He alone can drive the North Bank crazy. Shu Baosai had already been struck speechless numerous times on this day, but it was only now that he realized that Bai Xiaochun's power seemed limitless. Regardless, the atmosphere of the chosen battles had been completely changed. And yet, the matches would continue. The South Bank side was filled with admiration, and the North Bank stewed in their madness as the fourth set of matches began. Shangguan Tianyu, Ghost Fang, and Bai Xiaochun all had 3 victories to their names, so their presence wasn't even needed to finish the final rankings for the 4th, 5th, and 6th place spots. The Gongsun siblings and Shu Song took the floor to finish things. In the end, Gongsun Yun defeated Gongsun Waner, as well as Shu Song. No more battles were necessary to determine the rankings. Shu Song was not a match for Gongsun Yun, and even if he fought Gongsun Waner and lost, that one battle wouldn't change the final rankings. As such, Shu Song took 5th place. With 5 defeats, Gongsun Waner lost a bit of glory and took 6th place. 4th place went to Gongsun Yun. Next to be determined were the final rankings for the top 3 disciples. Everyone was watching with keen anticipation to see how Bai Xiaochun, Shangguan Tianyu and Ghost Fang would end up in the final standings. Of course, the North Bank disciples glared angrily at Bai Xiaochun the entire time. They approved of Ghost Fang and Shangguan Tianyu, but their opinion of Bai Xiaochun was that he was completely shameless and despicable. The North Bank's hopes all rested on Ghost Fang. As far as they were concerned, it wouldn't matter what plots Bai Xiaochun hatched, he was no match for Ghost Fang in terms of power, and would be crushed like a twig. First battle, Bai Xiaochun vs Shangguan Tianyu. Apparently due to Bai Xiaochun's antics, Ouyang Jia's voice was no longer as cold and sinister as it had been, and in fact, it almost seemed like he was sighing. Shangguan Tianyu looked up, a powerful gleam in his eye as he thought about how he'd been outdone by Bai Xiaochun in the qualifying round. As he walked out onto the arena floor, the breeze lifted his hair, making him look even more handsome than usual, like a precious sword that would cause countless disciples' eyes to glitter. Of course, none of the South Bank disciples dared to cheer. After all, Bai Xiaochun was also from the South Bank, and had many tricks up his sleeve. They feared that if they cheered for his opponent, he would remember and hold it against them. Therefore, they had no choice but to bite their tongues. The North Bank, on the other hand, actually did start to cheer for Shangguan Tianyu. In response, Shangguan Tianyu frowned, aware that they weren't really cheering for him, but against Bai Xiaochun. The North Bank would cheer for any opponent of Bai Xiaochun's, even if it were a pig. The thought left Shangguan Tianyu even more displeased than before. Bai Xiaochun cleared his throat and walked out onto the arena floor. Looking over at Shangguan Tianyu, he flicked his sleeve and smiled. Listen, there's no need for all this. We're both. Before he could finish speaking, however, Shangguan Tianyu's eyes blazed, and he waved his finger. Instantly, his flying sword pierced through the air as fast as a bolt of lightning. It moved so quickly that before Bai Xiaochun could even react, it was right there, a few inches in front of his face. Pupils constricting, mind bursting with a sensation of imminent crisis, he ducked down. A blast of wind from the sword buffeted him from above, and one of his hairs was severed, which then floated down in front of him. When cultivators fight, we seize every opportunity, Shangguan Tianyu said coolly. Even if you hadn't avoided that sword, it wouldn't have killed you. You are naughty and mischievous, and severely lacking in good family values. Since your father and mother didn't discipline you, I guess I'll step in to provide you with a bit of education. However, you'd better not use any vile or treacherous methods, and lose face for the South Bank. As he spoke, his flying sword circled back around and came to rest floating in front of him. The North Bank went quiet for a moment, then broke out into cheering. The South Bank maintained their silence. None of them seemed very happy with Shangguan Tianyu, and even some of the people who considered themselves his fans were frowning. After all, the South Bank disciples generally didn't hate Bai Xiaochun. Although he was somewhat naughty and mischievous, it wasn't excessive. He left them feeling a bit helpless sometimes, but they actually liked him. The North Bank hated him, but to the South Bank, he represented their hope for glory. Furthermore, it was obvious to everyone that Bai Xiaochun had been on the verge of conceding. Clearly, he'd hoped to keep from getting into a fierce fight with Shangguan Tianyu, thus sparing Shangguan Tianyu some spiritual power to use in his final battle with Ghostfang. Shangguan Tianyu had been aware of that too, and yet had attacked anyway, and in an underhanded way at that. Then he talked about educating Bai Xiaochun, and even dishonored his family. Behavior like that left many South Bank disciples quite uncomfortable. Bai Xiaochun knelt there, watching his hair float down in front of him. Slowly, his smile faded, and he looked up at Shangguan Tianyu, the word, education, ringing in his ears. You're a chosen, so if you want to look down on me, fine. I don't really care what other people think about me anyway. For some reason, something seemed different about Bai Xiaochun all of a sudden. You want to use underhanded attacks? That's your business. I practice cultivation so that I can live forever. I don't like fighting and killing. He waved his right hand off to the side, tossing the defensive amulets away. All of a sudden, it seemed as if his veins were filled with, not blood but steel. In the South Bank audience, Hu Yunfei's eyes glittered, and he couldn't stop himself from shaking. All of a sudden, he was looking at the same Bai Xiaochun who had saved him from the Luokan clan. But what gives you the right to step in for my dad and mom and educate me? Bai Xiaochun's eyes were completely bloodshot. His parents had both passed away when he was young, an event which had influenced him in profound ways. It was one of the biggest reasons why he began to wish to live forever. He was a generally optimistic person, an attitude he had intentionally fostered since a young age. There had been no other option. He had personally watched his parents die of illness. He remembered sitting with their corpses for days, weeping, refusing to believe that they were gone, even calling their names. Eventually, the corpses began to stink, and relatives came to bury them. Bai Xiaochun had been left in a daze, and at one point even took to talking to himself. If a child grew up in such a manner, his entire life would be one of darkness. So Bai Xiaochun replaced the crying with laughter. He began to think about the idea of living forever. He would never forget how his parents had died, and although he missed them, it only made him want to keep living. He was stubborn and mischievous, but not to an excessive degree. Many of the things he did were even accidents. Deep down, he was a good person. He feared death, and seemed weak on the outside, but when his friends were in danger, he would fight to the death to protect them. If he needed to, he could bellow in rage and risk his life on the field of battle. He liked to joke, but was also deeply emotional. Big Fatty Zhang, Li Qinghao, Hu Yunfei, Du Lingfei, Hu Xiaomei, the sect leader, and all the other people who treated him well, were people he would never, ever forget. What gives you the right? He suddenly burst into action, moving so quickly that he was instantly in front of Shangguan Tianyu. Shangguan Tianyu's eyes widened, and his hair stood on end, but before he could do a single thing in response, Bai Xiaochun's fist struck out, glittering with silver light. Rumbling sounds could be heard as Shangguan Tianyu's personal shield sprang up, but it was absolutely incapable of providing any defense. Bai Xiaochun's fist pierced through it like a hammer crushing ice. Just as it was about to land on Shangguan Tianyu, a tiny buckler appeared, which subsequently trembled and was sent flying off to the side. Bai Xiaochun's fist landed on Shangguan Tianyu's chest, causing blood to spray out of his mouth. Shangguan Tianyu felt as if a huge force had slammed into him, and he staggered backward 10 paces, coughing up more blood, an expression of utter incredulity on his face. Are you really chosen? Bai Xiaochun asked coolly. He didn't stick his jaw out. He didn't put on the air of a lonely hero. But everyone looking at him in that moment felt like they were looking at a blazing sun. Gasps could be heard among the South Bank disciples, and the North Bank audience was completely stunned. Ghostfang's eyes began to shine, and up on the balcony, the sect leader and the others had very serious expression on their faces. Bai Xiaochun, Shangguan Tianyu growled. Feeling completely humiliated, he roared and performed a double-handed incantation gesture. 5 flying swords appeared, all of which emanated terrifying sword chi. Taking control of them with his spirit sword body, Shangguan Tianyu sent them flying toward Bai Xiaochun. Rumbling could be heard as the swords blurred into motion, becoming 5 sword dragons, each one of them about 2 meters wide and 30 meters long. As they arced through the air, everything shook, and even the surface of the arena floor began to crumble. Based on the shocking level of energy they displayed, any one of the swords would be able to kill an ordinary disciple. 2 would definitely take out other elite disciples. As for chosen like Gongsun Yun, 3 would be enough to force him to concede. But now 5 appeared, filling the entire arena floor with a shocking sword aura. I don't know anything about sword techniques, Bai Xiaochun said coolly. Nor do I have a sword spirit body. But from what I know, that's not how you use swords. With that, he waved his finger, and the golden crow sword appeared, a golden beam of light that slashed toward the first of Shangguan Tianyu's swords. I don't care if you use 3 swords or 5, I only need 1. That one sword caused the sky to shake, and became an explosive stream of sword chi. That one sword used heaviness in lightness and lightness in heaviness. That one sword was backed by the perfect amount of spiritual power, without the slightest bit of wastage. It was true that Bai Xiaochun didn't really know anything about sword techniques. But he knew the violet chi cauldron control art, heaviness in lightness, and lightness in heaviness. He knew that, although a leaf could not be used to lift a log, if you rolled it up, it could lift a small rock. Furthermore, if you tore the leaf into strips and wove them together, it could lift an even heavier rock. He knew the proper way to manipulate spiritual power. Sometimes, mastering one technique was superior to knowing tens of thousands of them. In the chi condensation stage, his skill combined with his undying silver skin made him invincible. Boom! An ear-splitting explosion rocked the entire area, and countless chunks of rubble were thrown into the air. Bai Xiaochun's single sword strike became a tempest that slammed into Shangguan Tianyu's 5 sword dragons. The sword dragons twisted and distorted, and then exploded into countless fragments. Then the blast of wind continued on, slamming directly into Shangguan Tianyu's face. Bai Xiaochun stood there, his hair whipping in the wind, his expression placid. He didn't clasp his hands behind his back, and didn't flick his sleeve. He simply stood there, as calm as ice. It was a scene that would forever be etched into the minds of all disciples of the North and South Banks. Is that really Bai Xiaochun? Everyone felt as if their minds were about to explode. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.